dissect and segregate black neighborhoods from everyone else. Just like a kid living in Jackson Ward or Randolph doesn't benefit from a cohesive, thriving, historically black community because in the 50s, the downtown expressway and Interstates 195 tore right through those neighborhoods. And Mr. Speaker, a grandfather who lives blocks from here only gets to vote for who represents him in this room because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the year our democracy was finally available to all. And our recent history, Mr. Speaker, continues to impact us. Delegate Bagby, Delegate Torian, Delegate Hayes, me, whomever, Delegate Price or Munden King. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, we still grip our steering wheels a little bit tighter. Our hearts start to beat a little bit harder if we are driving and we see blue lights behind our car. And that is even with our House of Delegates license plates on there. And we know that's because of the history of over-policing. And what's interesting, Mr. Speaker, and even more disappointing, is that in this body this year, just weeks ago, we passed a bill out of here that recodified minor traffic infractions that we know are disproportionately and disparately enforced against black and brown drivers. This speaks to the still ever-present systemic and institutionalized racism that continues to pervade our society. And Mr. Speaker, just 2 years ago, my friend Delegate Bagby had to fight harder than he should have to remove racist language and text out of deeds. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, we cannot afford to go back. The House passed the pretextual bill, and yet on Friday, our governor released a report that eliminates all the conversations about equity, cultural competency, diversity in our schools. And I can think of no other way to describe it than an attempt to erase our history and prevent our students from receiving an honest, accurate education. It quite frankly is an assault on black history. Mr. Speaker, I really do wish black history was as simple as remembering facts, names, figures, but black history goes beyond the basic data. This history is ongoing. This history has real, meaningful, visceral impacts on each and every one of us today. But too often in this body and in our Commonwealth, we ignore these impacts. We choose to celebrate black history and black people when it's convenient. And Mr. Speaker, all of us, both major political parties, are guilty of this. And that's why we say in the Black Caucus, we don't have permanent friends. We don't have permanent enemies. We have permanent issues. Because see, Mr. Speaker, we have many examples. We can't tout our support for the black community when it comes to funding HBCUs or giving them preferential treatment on a lab school bill. But at the same time, eliminate the consider of race in applications for our youngest students in the governor's schools. We can't post on Twitter that Black Lives Matter, but when we come in here to press red or green on social equity pieces of a marijuana legislation or the pretextual stop bill I mentioned ago, all of a sudden it's inconvenient. And Mr. Speaker, we can't have folks ask us to take them to our churches during the election cycle and then turn around and vote against the bills that are directly counter to those same churchgoers' priorities. As Delegate Scott said a few weeks ago, black bodies are not a prop in a political campaign. Now, Mr. Speaker, it's no secret that the Black Caucus met with Governor Youngkin. One of our meetings, it was open to the public. And a few days after that, one of his senior staffers asked me, and he remarked, he said, it's personal. It feels personal. Is it personal? And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I answered honestly. I said it is personal. I said black folks in particular don't have the privilege of treating what happens in this room and on this Capitol Square purely as a policy discussion. What happens in this room affects people we love, our kids, our parents, our partners, our spouses. There's no way for it not to be personal. What happens in this room and on this square affects us differently, Mr. Speaker, because we have a very, very different lived experience. Let me give you an example, Mr. Speaker. On a sweltering day in June 2020, my wife and I took our 2 children to Marcus David Peters Circle. My son Joseph was 7 at the time. He circled the monument, and I could see his eyes studying the community memorials to black people whose lives were taken too early. Unfortunately, those lives were taken too early, in many instances by people who were sworn to protect and serve. And Mr. Speaker, if any of you watched a 7-year-old trying to figure something out, I saw the gears in his mind turning, processing. And I thought to myself, how do I explain to my 7-year-old what all this means? And Mr. Speaker, before I could come up with an answer, before I could come up with a strategy, the questions came. And Mr. Speaker, that conversation and others like it are not ones that everyone in this chamber has to have with their children. I have to have conversations with my kids that many of you don't have to have, about walking in the mall, about driving, about how they are perceived because of the color of their skin. And Mr. Speaker, this is a photo of my son Joseph that day in June 2020. And Mr. Speaker, we know that as George Floyd was taking his last breaths, all he wanted was his mother. And that's Joseph clinging to his mother. And so, Mr. Speaker, when people ask me if it's personal, why we always talk about race, this is why. Because these issues are personal. And this is why we fight as hard as we do and as passionately as we do. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not a pastor, but I am a believer. And in the Gospel of Luke, a crowd asked the prophet John the Baptist 4 simple words. What should we do? In reply, John says, whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none. Whoever has food must do likewise. Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I see a lot of coats in here. We are all privileged to be in this body. But we, unfortunately, do not share all the same privileges because of our history. What can I do? What can we do? We have to make our decisions so that my kids, your kids, don't have to have the same conversations that I've had with mine. And Mr. Speaker, I can tell by the looks on the faces and the heads down in some that it's uncomfortable hearing this. It's uncomfortable dealing with these issues, and I agree. But we've got to get to the truth, and we've got to have uncomfortable conversations about how black and brown people are still treated in our Commonwealth. We need to reckon with these truths every day, not just in February. And going forward, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen, I hope we would consider black history and the complexity of that in all the decisions that we make. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.